Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our, I believe this is our sixth installment of Webinar Wednesday in 2021. You will notice that you have been entered the room on mute and with your video off. We do ask that you keep your video off during the presentation, just because some of the people joining us have limited internet capability, and the more videos we have on, the harder it is to stream that. So I'll be turning mine off momentarily as well. You do have the ability to unmute, and if you have any questions throughout, if Troy is okay with it, feel free to unmute and ask questions or throw them into the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you do need Master Dairy credit for this particular webinar, I am throwing a link in the chat right now. Please go here after the meeting is over and fill out just a kind of general completion report. Tell us what you liked, tell us what you didn't, tell us all how amazing Troy did and that you want him to come back every single month and do another one of these. Troy goes, no, don't say that. But anyway, tell us what you liked, tell us what you want to see in the future. And we're glad you joined us today. So with that, I guess I should probably introduce Troy a little bit. Troy Rowan is a new assistant professor in the Department of Animal Science, working with the Genomics Center and focusing also on beef extension a little bit. So he was gracious enough to join us today and talk a little bit about beef on dairy crossbreeding. So with that, I'll turn it over to someone much more qualified than me to talk about this. And thank you, Troy, for your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Liz, and thanks everybody for tuning in. So let me see if I can find my slides here and share them and start presenting, and hopefully this all looks good. But like Liz said, my name is Troy Rowan, and I'm an assistant professor here in the department. My main focus is in beef cattle genomics research and extension. But today I've been bugging Liz for a long time about talking about beef on dairy and thinking more about beef on dairy. So Liz finally gave me the opportunity to talk a little bit about this, something that's been on my mind for a while and that has, as you all know, really picked up some steam in the industry. And I think that the beef industry in talks that I'm having, particularly with our seed stock producers, this is something that's on a lot of people's minds. So I think a really hot topic in the beef industry now, and not just something that the dairy industry is thinking about. So I want to start off my presentation today with a disclaimer, and that's that I know very, very little about the dairy industry. I'm not the expert here. That's definitely Liz. So if there are little things that I completely missed the mark on, it's probably just due to my my lack of understanding of the ins and outs of the dairy industry. But I'm going to try my best here, and I'll also say that I'm not an economist, so I don't have a ton of economic data to back up these little bits of information. So maybe Charlie Martinez, who I saw is on this, can pop on and do one of these in the future on the economics of beef on dairy crossbreeding. But what I'm really going to focus on today are three main things about why we want to use beef on dairy. And this first one I'll spend by far the most time on, and that's this idea of creating more valuable male calves in your herd, right? That's the obvious benefit to using a beef on dairy crossbreeding program in your dairy herd. But I'll also mention a little bit here about how do we make females, better females faster. So really using an organized beef and dairy crossbreeding program to accelerate that purebred dairy female side, in addition to making these higher value male calves. And then finally, this idea of making just the replacements that you need, right? So some more organized thinking, moving past this idea of let's just stick a straw of beef semen in to see if we can get a pregnancy. That's still really the foundation of why a lot of people are using beef on dairy crossbreeding. But with a little bit more planning, we can add a lot of value and make quicker genetic progress at various points in our dairy herds. So the idea that I'll start off with, and again, this is going to be just a small slice of what I talk about today, is that using beef on dairy in sexed dairy semen in a concerted manner is going to allow you to make better females faster, right? So in a typical conventional only dairy semen situation, where we have this distribution of the females in our herd, some of these females are elite, some of these are, second, third, fourth lactation cows that are lower genetic merit, they're old genetics. But what we're doing traditionally is we've gone on and bred to non-sexed dairy semen. We get an even number of dairy bulls and dairy heifers. And the average genetic merit of our heifers each year is right here smack in the middle, right? So it works. We can make genetic progress this way, but it's a little bit slower than some of these other methodologies that I'm going to talk about. So with the introduction of sex-sorted semen fairly recently, I guess it's probably been almost a decade or so now, that's become widely available, we can start to use sexed female dairy semen on these top tier animals. And what that's going to do is it's going to move this average for the female genetic merit over here towards the right. So we're going to be making genetic progress a little bit faster. But again, following everything up with conventional on this side, what we're left with is a little bit slower genetic progress for the average female compared to the next option that I'll show. And then still about half of these conventional semen individuals end up being bull calves. But the real developments that have happened in the last 5 to 10 years is this idea of using sex semen on your top end females, whether that's your top half, your top third. This is all going to depend on how many replacements you need every year. But what you'll see is that compared to these other two methods, we continue to move this average female's genetic merit over here closer to the very best of our females. And then when we throw beef semen in the mix, we're not only making more replacement females from our top cows, making genetic progress faster, but we're also adding value to these calves that are being produced from our bottom end females. These are cows that we just need to lactate. We need them to have a live calf, but all of a sudden we have this opportunity when you look at what's sort of day old calf prices are. These are from Kentucky. Charlie Martinez was kind enough to pull these for me. And we're never going to see 2015 again, right, as far as dairy bull calf prices go. But what I have seen is that the average Angus Holstein calf is coming in. These are day old calves, over $250 a head. So this is really a fantastic way by not changing anything but the semen that's getting put into a cow to instantly add value to these day old calves. So a really unique opportunity that I think the dairy industry has. And then what I'll keep speaking to throughout this presentation is that this is really just the start, right? This immediate added value to the day old calf is the start, but with various levels of inputs and retained ownership, I think that dairy producers have a lot of opportunities to keep adding value throughout the course of that calf's life and all throughout the supply chain. So we'll talk a little bit about that more as I move on today. But really, I think a unique opportunity to add value, particularly on those lower end cows in your herd. So one of the big questions is, which traits in a beef bull are going to be the most important? And by far, this has been the truth since the very first straw of beef semen was put in a dairy cow. But fertility is far and away the most important trait that we have in a beef bull when we're trying to select them for a beef on dairy crossbreeding program. We need bulls that are going to cause cows to conceive, right? That pregnancy is worth far more than any other thing that a beef animal can add, because at the end of the day, your dairies are still in the milk making business, and you got to have that live calf. But after that, we'll start looking at things like calving ease, gestation period. So really trying to drive down any sort of dystocia issues, calving issues, and making that gestation period quicker so that we're turning cows around, getting them into lactation quicker. And then finally, we can start to think about this feedlot and carcass performance. Traditionally, this hasn't been a huge concern for folks that are using dairy bulls in their beef bulls in their dairy herd, because these calves are gone after a day and they're not getting compensated for those downstream profit sources that superior feedlot and carcass performance would contribute. And so when we think about male fertility, the really important thing to keep in mind is that these cows that are getting beef semen traditionally are going to be lower genetic merit cows, and they're going to be lower fertility, right? These are going to be second and third service cows. Really all we need, right, is to get some semen in these cows and hope that they conceive. And again, getting a live beef calf on the ground is the number one concern when we're looking at this beef on dairy crossbreeding. So what we know about male fertility is that it's moderately heritable. So there's lots of different subtraits that come into this male fertility picture. These include things like sperm motility, sperm head shape, cavastation, all these things that come together, and all of their heritabilities are moderate. So around 0.3 for heritability. So these are things that we can make genetic progress on if we have the data to put together selection tools for male fertility. We also know, anecdotally at least, that there's quite a few examples of bull on cow effects affecting this male fertility. So certain bulls that'll go just crazy, be crazy fertile in one section of cows, and then you put them in another section of cows and the results aren't nearly as good. So there's these issues of bull and cow effects, and disentangling those is something that a lot of the reproductive physiology folks here at the University of Tennessee are starting to think about. But as far as industry developments go, the dairy industry has had genetic predictions for sire conception rate for a while now. This is something that, due to the lack of reproductive records in the beef industry, something that we're lagging really way behind the dairy folks in. We haven't been able to get these genetic predictions for sire fertility, but once we do, you can expect that there will be pretty strong selection put on that across the beef industry, particularly as it relates to beef on dairy animals, where male fertility is really one of the central traits that you all are looking for. And then finally, there's been some interest in doing pooled semen approaches. So this is similar to how the swine industry works, where you have a bunch of terminal sires and you're pooling all their semen together and breeding all your sows to them. Something similar with these beef animals, right? A bunch of high genetic merit beef bulls. You're sort of able to hedge your bets on some of these bull and cow effect issues that you might see pop up. But lots of different ways for us to address this male fertility issue. And I know that a lot of the studs are working on this, as well as beef breed associations trying to get a handle on this sire conception rate issue. And I think that'll have a very big effect on how things shake out in the beef on dairy industry as we move forward. And so again, as we start to think about the beef on dairy calf that's worth the most money at the end of the day, there's nothing that adds more value to a calf than being alive, right? So an easy calving animal that's alive and kicking on day one. And second, we really are interested in having a solid black calf. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we start to move into this added value, calf sourcing, all of this. Having a solid black calf is worth a lot when it comes to these crossbred animals. We also like to have them pulled. And then we also, at the end of the day, want them to have some growth and carcass potential, so that they're the sort of animals that we want to enter into the food chain at the end of the day. So I'm going to spend, again, most of the time today talking about how the beef industry is reacting to this big, wide open opportunity of putting beef bulls into the dairy business and adding value to these beef on dairy crossbred carcasses and all of the things that come along with it. And so I saw this quote today in some of my searching as I was adding slides to the presentation, but feeder cattle investors don't have to play in the unknown quality market anymore. And this is true in the beef cattle, the commercial beef cattle production, but it's also very true in this beef on dairy crossbreeding. So feeder cattle investors have gotten to the point where there's enough beef on dairy animals out there that they can start to be a little bit picky as far as quality, the genetic potential of these animals, and the things that go into getting this animal ready to enter into a feedlot. So feeder cattle investors are conscientious about this, and that's all playing into a lot of the tools and management strategies that the beef industry has come up with in the last few years to address these problems. So the big $1 million question for every dairy producer is what should I do? How should I utilize beef on dairy in my particular operation? And my answer to this, like my answer to most every question I get, is that it depends. So there's going to be a lot of factors that play into what beef on dairy might look like in your particular dairy. But I really think that I want to give you as much information as I can on the opportunities that are out there. And then you and Liz, or you and Liz and I, or you and Liz and Charlie and I can get together and start talking about these sort of strategies that make the most sense for your particular operation. So the big thing that I'll talk about today, right, is moving past a pregnancy. So again, getting that dairy cow pregnant so she can get back into lactation is always going to be the most important thing. But with this opportunity, we can start to think about adding value at various points in this animal's life. And I think that these are very important considerations to start thinking about, right? Moving past getting a dairy cow pregnant with beef semen to producing beef animals and producing beef that goes onto the consumer's plate at the end of the day. So the big things that I'll point out here is that your relationships with calf ranches, feedlots, sale barns, whatever, these are going to be very, very important as it comes to adding value to these beef on dairy crossbred animals. There's also the potential for retaining ownership, which I'll talk about on the next slide, to really cut out the middleman in a lot of these. If it works for your particular operation, you can really reap the benefits of using elite beef animals on your dairy cows. And then lots of opportunities for added value calf marketing. Most of these are being headed up by the semen studs, really trying to have these added value marketing programs so that they can source elite beef on dairy crossbred animals to place into feedlots and hopefully return a little bit of that value to your dairy herd. And then finally, we'll also talk about some of these sire selection tools. So the breed associations and beef cattle are really understanding that this dairy thing is here to stay, and trying to provide tools, not just generalized to the beef industry, but specifically tailored to doing beef on dairy crossbreeding. And like I said, I was going to mention a little bit here about retaining ownership. So this is something that I tell my producers in the beef industry to think about, and I'll say the same thing to you all, that these day-old calf sales is going to cap your value, right? That $250 day-old calf or calf that you've reared a little bit to weaning, that's the ultimate amount of value. But if you're doing the genetic decisions right, you're adding value on that front, making animals that have the genetic potential to excel in the feedlot and on the rail, all of a sudden, you have the opportunity to capture a lot of that money that's getting lost to the middlemen, right? So rearing these calves to 400 pounds, transitioning them to a feedlot, and then retaining ownership throughout their lives is going to allow you to reap the benefits of these carcass payouts. And I'll show you some examples of some of the carcass data that's coming back on these beef on dairy animals. And it's really impressive, and there's premiums to be had there. But again, like I said, I'm not an economist. This is something that's going to vary from operation to operation. It's going to depend on how much money you're willing to invest on this beef on dairy side, how many replacements you're trying to keep, what sort of share of your population this is going to make up. But again, something to keep in mind, that there's a lot of money to be added to these calves if you're able to hold on to them longer. And the other big thing that I'll talk about is this idea of certified Angus beef, right? This is the ultimate in added value marketing. The certified Angus beef brand is really, really recognizable. They've done a wonderful job of marketing. And as a result, these calves are worth a lot more when you go to sell them. So the idea of taking a beef on dairy crossbred animal and all of a sudden having them become a certified Angus beef carcass, that has the potential to add a ton of value to these animals that otherwise would have been sort of castaways in your program. So the quick requirements that I'll go through with CAB is this predominantly solid black animal. And again, you'll hear me say this multiple times throughout my presentation. Having a pure black calf is really worth a ton when it comes to adding value throughout their lives, right? Feeders are willing to pay more for these solid black calves. They come with this certified Angus beef branding at the end of their life if they meet some of these other marks. So if you're retaining ownership, you have the potential with one of these solid black animals who has modest to high marbling. Dairy animals already do a pretty good job of this. A big ribeye, which we'll talk a little bit more later. And then ultimately animals that are moderately thick to thick muscle. So this specification in CAB was designed to eliminate dairy animals from being considered CAB animals. But as you'll see, the Angus Association is actually starting to develop some selection tools that help us select for these beef on dairy calves that are going to look a little bit more like a beef steer when you put them in a feedlot. So again, they can reap the benefits of this certified Angus beef branding. So a really, really huge opportunity, again, to add value to these carcasses. And so when we start to think about breeding for beef, there are a couple of things to keep in mind, and that's that dairy carcasses aren't, we're not starting from ground zero, right? They already have about the right frame size for what we're looking for in a beef carcass, and there's never been much of an issue with quality grade. These animals are going to marble, whether they're Holstein or Jersey. So we have some pretty good opportunities there to build on an already good marbling, the sort of animal that we want, and then add on some of these beef characteristics that are going to fix some of the issues that come with dairy carcasses. The first of that is carcass weight, right? These animals don't have nearly as big a carcasses as beef animals, and they take longer to get there, right? Another issue that we run into in dairy carcasses are these sunken strips, is what we call them. So narrow strips and ribs, where you'll see this dairy animals is much skinnier, whereas this beef type animal has a much bigger, rounder ribeye compared to the dairy animal. So trying to fix this issue, as well as feed efficiency, and then also these consistency issues, right? You can have a really good pen of dairy steers, and a lot of people have made money on good pens of dairy steers, but there's a lot of variation across the spectrum there. So the beef on dairy cross is really aimed at trying to fix these issues and make these animals more consistent so that feeders and packers know what they're getting when they're getting a beef on dairy animal. And so what I have here is a really quick case study that I'll go over. This comes from Wolf Cattle. So they're a large limousine producer up in Minnesota and the Dakotas. And they also own a very large, I want to say it's nearly 20,000 cow, mostly Jersey dairy, called Riverview. And for a long time, this was my first exposure at the Beef Improvement Federation, probably 4 or 5 years ago, to this idea of beef on dairy crossbreeding. And Jerry Wolf of Wolf Cattle presented some of this data. And these are just pens of limousine Jersey cross steers compared to their contemporaries, which are purebred Jersey steers. And really across the board, there's a lot to like about these limousine Jersey crosses. And Wolf has done a lot of testing across all cattle breeds on these Jersey animals. And limousine sort of rises to the top for them. But I'll talk about some other breeds as we go on throughout the presentation. And just a couple of things to point out here as we look at some of this feedlot and carcass data from these animals. These beef on dairy crossbred animals have significantly larger carcasses, right? And they're gaining almost, twice and then some average daily gain in the feedlot, and they're doing it on less feed. So they're more efficient, they gain way faster. And then when we go and look at the grades, they grade out better. So about 10% of these animals are prime, the rest of them choice, whereas these purebred Jersey steers are overwhelmingly choice, but a handful of selects in there. And again, you're not going to take much of a hit when it comes to yield grade, bigger ribeyes. So really across the board, these Jersey limousine cross steers at Riverview are adding a ton of value. And again, this is because these folks are retaining ownership through the end of these calves' lives and getting paid for these superior carcasses once we get these animals up on rail. And so one of the big things that I've heard a lot more about in the last year or so are these ideas of creating genetic tools specifically tailored to beef on dairy production. And so there's this question, there are, as you saw, a lot of different things that go into balancing selection for traits for beef on dairy. So all of these different traits that are going to add value, but really we don't want dairy producers to have to go back to square one, learn all of our expected progeny differences in addition to the dairy proofs. That's a lot to get a handle on. So really trying to distill these down into indexes, much like the dairy indexes that you all are more familiar with. So putting together a selection index for beef on dairy production is a major priority in these breed associations. And then keeping in mind that the top beef bull is not necessarily going to be the top beef on dairy bull, right? So there's some difference between these two groups of bull. An awesome terminal sire for a commercial cow-calf producer here in Tennessee is not going to be the same terminal beef sire to go into a dairy operation and excel. And then finally, are we doing genetic predictions for all the traits that we want to improve in the dairy industry? So just a quick refresher here about economic selection indexes. This is probably something that you're familiar with when you look at your dairy proofs, something like TPI, where we have this index value of an individual is going to be the genetic potential for that animal in a particular scenario. That's some combination of a bunch of different trait predictions. So in the context of beef cattle, these are EPDs, expected progeny differences. And then what we're going to do is take all of these EPDs. So we might have a carcass weight EPD, a ribeye area EPD, and then an average daily gain EPD. We're able to weight these EPDs by their economic weights. So this is a dollar value. So we're putting an actual economic value on these and saying how much or how many dollars does a 1 unit increase in one of these predictions in one of these EPDs contribute to the animal's value, right? So this is going to change based on our production system. So something that as we start crafting these for beef on dairy contexts, we have to be very conscientious that the production costs in a beef industry, the relative value of each of these predictions is going to be different from the value that they see in a beef on dairy situation. And then what we do is we give weights to each of these predictions and then put them together into this single index. So what this allows us to do is directly compare animals and aggregate all of these things together so that we're only looking at one value that's a direct quantifier of how profitable that animal is going to be in the situation in which the index is created for. And so I'll mention here to start off with some work that the American Angus Association and Angus Genetics Incorporated has done recently on developing terminal indexes that are targeted at beef on dairy crossbreeding. So they've recently rolled out these two indexes. The first is a Holstein index that's $A by H. So this is the dollar Angus Holstein index, and then a similar one for Angus on Jersey crossbreeding. And so Angus reports this dollar beef is one of their major indexes that's designed for Angus animals or Angus bulls that are going out and creating terminal type cattle. So this uses $B as a starting point, and you'll see these are the traits that get included in each of these indexes. $B to start with doesn't include any sort of calving ease or growth to weaning. But again, these are going to be two things that are very important as we start to think about producing beef dairy crossbred calves. So Angus goes in and they've added some economic weight to calving ease as well as growth to weaning. And then two other things that we have to be conscientious about, like I said, is if we want these certified Angus beef animals to come out of a beef on dairy cross, we need animals that are heavy muscled, that look more like beef animals. So we want these beef type animals in the feedlot. We want these beef type carcasses on the rail. So what Angus does is they've gone through and created a couple of other genetic predictions that are sort of combinations of traits that are already being produced, having to do with muscling and height. And these are included in the Holstein index, both of them. So trying to make those Holstein Angus cross animals heavier muscled, while also trying to tone down some of that frame size and that carcass length that we get from a typical Holstein steer, but maybe not something that we're that interested in changing in those Jersey animals that are a little bit smaller framed and more compact. And so the first thing that we do, I'll just talk very briefly about this, is as we try to address the muscling issue, when we look across all of these animals and their weight, so this is the weight when they were scanned, and then an ultrasound ribeye measure. So this is going to be how big their ribeye is. As you get bigger here, that means a bigger ribeye. What you'll see is that this is kind of just a shotgun shot. And when we look at each of these data points of an animal, what you'll see is that there's a lot of animals that have similar weights, but exemplary ribeye measures, right? And then a lot of animals that have, the same measure for a ribeye, but really vary in their weight. And so what we're interested in doing in these dairy animals is that when we look at ribeye versus this newly calculated muscling EPD, we want to get rid of these animals that have small ribeyes and low muscling, and put negative economic weight on this sort of a combination of traits, small ribeyes and small amounts of muscling, and select for animals that are up here that are more heavily muscled and have bigger ribeyes that they can contribute to these beef on dairy crossbred calves. And then something similar happens for addressing height and Holstein. So the $B index is really heavily correlated with the animal's yearling height measurements. So what this means is that if we're using $B to select bulls for a beef on dairy crossbreeding program, we're going to get animals that are much, much taller, much, much longer, creating those undesirable dairy looking carcasses. But what Angus has done is they've gone in and done some adjustments to this index such that there's basically a 0% correlation between this Angus on Holstein index and the height EPD for these animals. So by selecting bulls that have large $A by H values, you're not going to be adding to the genetic potential for big, tall, and long animals in the Holstein breed. So really, again, moving towards this beef type carcass. And just briefly, as we look at these together in aggregate, comparing the beef on or the $B value, so this is for terminal beef cattle, to these two beef on dairy indexes, you'll see how each of these different weights is slightly altered. Again, putting a heavier weight on muscling, trying to make these beef type animals and beef type carcasses, a pinch of calving ease that isn't economically weighted in the $B index, with a little bit less weight on marbling than we have in the $B, again, because these Angus and Holstein animals already have the potential to marble. And then at the end of the day, there's a moderate correlation between these two indexes and $B. And I also want to throw this in. There's a really nice slide deck here from the director of the American Angus genetics group that I think she does a really good job of walking through some of their considerations and how they arrived at these indexes. Again, that's linked in this presentation. And then one other thing, again, that I'll just underline is that a great Angus terminal bull doesn't necessarily equal a great beef on dairy candidate. So there's lots of ways for these animals to fail, whether that's with calving ease, that height EPD, muscling. So animals that excel in a terminal beef production sense might not be the best for a beef on dairy. Again, underlining why these specific beef on dairy selection tools are becoming more and more important, because there's lots of ways for an animal to get really dropped in this beef on dairy index, while they'd otherwise be a great candidate for a terminal program on the beef side. I'll just briefly mention that the American Simmental Association has also been working with the Holstein Association in developing a Simmental dairy index. So again, this is going to be very similar to Angus with a heavy emphasis on calving ease, muscle conformation, ability to grade out, and then keeping in mind that we want to keep these carcass lengths in check, and has economic assumptions that are uniquely tailored to Holstein cattle production. So this is the initial question that Liz posed to me that I'm getting to about 2/3 of the way through my presentation is which breed should I use? And my answer to this is a pretty resounding, it depends, just like with everything else. But I want to walk through some of the considerations to take into as we start thinking about breeds, and also present just a little bit of data comparing a handful of beef breeds on a small scale, but I think it'll give you some context in how the certain beef breeds might fit into a particular beef on dairy scenario. So the considerations, that it depends of all this, is that at the end of the day, it's all going to come down to marketing considerations, right? If you're just concerned with a pregnancy, my suggestion would be to find the highest fertility beef bull that you can find, who has the cheapest semen, and use that, right? And that's going to be your best bet at getting a cow pregnant with a live calf. If you're going to have day-old calves, that's going to really, if you're going to sell day-old calves, that's also going to depend on, are you sourcing these somewhere? Is somebody paying you for some sort of an added value premium for having some source verification on these animals? Are you retaining these animals to feeders? In which case you want a little bit quicker growth up to that magic 400 pound point, as you can transition those animals into a feedlot. And then if you're retaining ownership, that really throws a wrench into things, because there are even more considerations about carcass quality, time to gain, and all those that go into to choosing a bull if you're going to retain ownership and try and reap some of those carcass premiums. And then finally, whether you're going to be breeding these to heifers versus cows. Typically, these are going to be bred to cows, but another thing to keep in mind, carcass traits that you're interested in, And something that if you have a calf buyer or wherever you're marketing your calves, visit with them about the things that make the most sense that they can pay you a premium for, so that you're not shooting into the dark and hoping that it turns out well. They'll be able to give you as good an idea as anything about which direction you should take the beef genetics if you decide to go this route on some of these lower end cows. But again, remembering at the end of the day that bull fertility should be above everything else. Trying to get these cows pregnant should be every dairy's chief concern. All right, so I want to walk through this paper really quick. I actually just ran across this today. A group from Ohio State went through and evaluated really in a lot of detail feedlot carcass retail cut performance for these Jersey and crossbred Jersey steers. I gave the link to the paper. I'm just going to feature a couple of the tables in this presentation, but I think it was a really nice initial look into how these carcasses actually are performing from these beef on dairy crosses. And one thing that I'll point out before I present any of this information is that when we're making comparisons between breeds, so you'll see an Angus, a Sim Angus, and a Limousine, I believe here, keep in mind that with sample sizes like in this study, there's always going to be way more variation within these breeds than there is between them, right? So these are likely one sire bred to a group of Jersey cows, and then we're making comparisons. So try and take less stake in maybe the single Angus column of these next tables, but think about how all the different bulls and Angus taken together could look a lot different, right? So don't compare Jersey to Simmental to Angus here, but compare these beef animals to these dairy animals, okay? So what we're showing here is a table of terminal sire breeds. So these are columns where they look at Jersey, Jersey on Jersey, Angus on Jersey, Sim Angus on Jersey, and then Wagyu on Jersey, and how these animals perform in the feedlot. And the things that I'll point out is really, again, this stark difference in the animal's average daily gain, the gain to feed, right? So these animals are more efficient than these purebred dairy steers. And then at the end of the day, they're getting to this finished point much faster. So what's that? Almost 70 days faster to finish these Angus animals out than for these purebred Jersey steers. So this is a really nice illustration of how these animals perform in the feedlot. And again, you're going to get a little bit more gain from these Sim Angus animals. You're going to, approximately the same days to finish. These Wagyus are going to take a little bit longer to finish, but you'll maybe reap a little bit more of the rewards on the carcass quality side. So when we dial down and look at carcass performance, the things I'll point out here is that compared to purebred Jersey steers, whoops, that went too fast. The yield grade differences are not significant here. So you're going to have about the same yield grade on your purebred Jersey steers as you will in these beef on dairy cross animals. But really the big kicker here is the quality grade, right? So of these, again, a small sample size, but all 9 of these Angus animals are high choice or above, which would qualify them as certified Angus beef. So a really nice thing to see there if you have these Angus Jersey cross animals compared with a lot of these Jersey animals that are, maybe mid to low choice is sort of the peak of their quality grade that you're going to see. But similar results across the Simmental, and then you're getting a few more of these prime and high choice animals in the Wagyu crosses. But just a nice little illustration of the carcass performance. And then again, what I mean when I say beef type is that if I were driving through a feedlot and saw a pen of heifers like this one, I'd be really hard pressed to say that she was a half dairy animal, right? She really doesn't look like a half Jersey. And when you look at her steak, this big, thick ribeye, you're also thinking that this probably looks a lot more like a beef carcass than it does a dairy carcass, right? So really transitioning not only from these metrics, but changing the animals to look a little bit more like a beef animal goes a really long ways when it comes to feeders and people that are going to be paying for these premiums on animals. So I'll walk through some of the considerations on each of these breeds very briefly. The first being Angus. So I want to say that Angus has about a 75% share in the beef on dairy crossbreeding world. So they're overwhelmingly the largest breed that's used in this context because they really put together a lot of things that are important, right? So calving ease, above all, and you're always going to get a homozygous black, homozygous polled calf. And those things, like I said, are worth as much as anything. So this smaller frame size is also going to work out nice. And they have fairly good carcass weights when you look at them on the rail. The only issues might be that they do have very low birth weights compared to these other beef breeds. So that's, again, a good thing in the sense of easy calving, but you might get a dock from a calf buyer if you're selling these day-old calves. They also aren't going to have nearly as big of a ribeye as some of these terminal animals. So like a Limousine or a Charolais, they're going to have a little bit smaller ribeyes. But again, that sort of selection pressure that the Angus indexes that they've developed should help select for bulls that'll go into a beef on dairy operation and contribute to some larger ribeyes. The next and probably next most common in this context is Limousine and Lim Flex. So a Lim Flex is going to be a crossbred Limousine Angus bull. And again, these are an excellent candidate for crossing with Jerseys. They're going to be a little bit bigger, beefier, framier animals that you get a lot of nice complementarity with Jersey animals. So you're going to get bigger ribeyes, higher growth, more feed efficient than an Angus animal. And these Lim Flexes will likely be homozygous black and homozygous polled due to that Angus ancestry. So a really nice cross in a lot of contexts, though you may sacrifice a little bit from a calving ease standpoint, and as well as marbling. They're not going to marble quite as well as Angus animals. But again, if you're putting these on a Jersey animal that already has that genetic potential to marble, it maybe isn't quite as big of a deal. And then again, just because they're not quite as common, they don't have as big of a market share in the dairy crossbreeding sense. There's going to be fewer sire options than Angus, and they don't have any tools at the moment that I'm aware of that are specifically tailored to beef on dairy production. So then the next one I'll talk about again is Simmental. Many of the same things that you saw in Limousine, bigger ribeyes, heavier carcasses, growthier. Some of these are going to be homozygous black and polled, though you will get some red genetics scattered in there. So something to keep in mind as you go looking at Simmental bulls potentially. And then one that's become a bigger deal overseas, where people aren't getting quite the same premiums for solid black hided animals, is Charolais, which is a breed that I'm partial to. My family raises these, but really unprecedented size and growth that you'll get from Charolais. Really heavily muscled, big carcasses. They're going to have a higher birth weight if you're selling these calves as day olds. They'll have a little bit more of a jump start in that early life gain. But you're going to lose that black-hided premium in the States, which is a really, really big deal. So again, something that might work in some contexts, but not necessarily in others. And then so how I'll close here, I'll blow through these pretty quickly because I want to leave some time for questions, but is how some of the semen companies are reacting and some of the marketing programs that they've come up with to help users of beef on dairy crossbreeding really reap the benefits of these things financially. So generally, I'll sort of do an overview on the programs from Alta, Select Sires, Gen X, and ABS. Everybody's got these, but these are the ones that I'll focus on in this presentation. But the idea that these semen companies are starting to identify sires that are specifically suited for beef on dairy. So these are elite terminal genetics to start with, that they've gone through and done internal genetic evaluations for things like fertility, gestation period, as well as some of these terminal traits that we really care about in these beef on dairy crossbred animals. And each of these also is accompanied by a source verified marketing option. So if you're selling calves, really at any stage, there's the potential to pay a small fee to some of these stud companies. You'll get a verified tag, and you immediately add a value to that animal because buyers know that animal comes from high quality genetics. They have the potential to excel in the feedlot and on the rail, and that opens up a whole variety of marketing partnerships for these semen companies to help breeders really reap the benefits of this crossbreeding. And then again, some of these also have custom selection tools that aren't being done in these individual breed associations that will help a dairy producer pick out the right bull for their operation. So again, this idea that feeders are going to pay for information And having verified genetics is going to lower their risk that they're taking on when they're buying this young animal, and it's going to ultimately result in more profit for them. But it also allows dairy producers who are using beef animals to reap a little bit of that, reap some of the benefits of making that choice. And a lot of this is going to come down to standardized calf rearing, which I am in no way suited to talk about to you today. But I have pasted some resources in at the end of the talk about how calf rearing in a beef context is going to be different than how things are handled in a dairy context. It's not sort of the same one size fits all rearing of these calves. So the first I'll mention is ABS's New Era in Focus program. So a lot of these are internally bred ABS bulls with validated genetics, focusing on again, male fertility, calving ease, gestation length, and stillbirth. They have this blue tag program to reap a little bit of the financial benefits of using these proven beef on dairy tailored sires. But I really am impressed with some of the data that they've collected and are reporting. I'm in no way talking about ABS more for any reason other than the fact that they have this data available. And so they've gone through and done some work comparing this ABS T14 line. This is a crossbred Sim Angus terminal line that ABS is bred internally with sort of conventional Angus in ABS's bull lineup. And they see about a 1.3 times advantage in beef sire fertility in this particular terminal line at ABS. So again, when fertility is by far the most important thing, that's a really nice stat to see. They see that these beef on dairy T14 calves are reaching this point of 400 pounds when they can head out to a feedlot much earlier than the average industry Angus bull, and even faster than some of the Angus bulls at ABS. And then these animals, again, higher feed conversion ratios, higher cost of gain savings. So we're putting less money into these animals and they're gaining more. And then at the end of the day, they're worth a lot more than a generic Holstein Angus animal. So some nice data there for you to dig more into. I've left some of the sources here if you would like to read a little bit more about these things. Alta has their Bullseye program, where they've got 4 unique indexes tailored to a herd's beef on dairy needs. So one that's very heavily weighted towards fertility, another for people that just want to make calves that have a black hide that they can sell 1 or 2 days after birth, another for folks that are interested in raising these calves until they're weaned, up to 300 to 500 pounds. And then another index, again, for this point where folks are retaining ownership and want to get paid for that carcass merit. Select Sires, again, has similar programs where they are selecting for bulls within their battery that are very strong for these traits. And they're out there field testing this male fertility, which is a really unique thing as well. These bulls are verified, highly fertile. And then they have buyer partnerships with Top Dollar Angus, TD Beef, Power Genetics, and this red tag branding program that allow you to reap some of those benefits of using Select Sires line of beef on dairy bulls. And then Gen X Shift does something similar. Again, all these traits that I've talked about in breeding strategy consultation and marketing assistance for these calves through the use of these source verified tags. Like I said, I'm far from a calf rearing expert, but just keeping in mind that the nutritional and rearing needs of these beef dairy crossbred calves are going to be different than your just pure dairy calves. But that doesn't mean that they require less. They just need some different treatment. There's some links here that discuss these and give it some more resources if you're interested in reading a bit more about that. Or I'm sure Liz could help you out with more specifics as far as that goes. So with that, I think have about used up most of my time, but I want to leave some for questions. My big takeaways for you all today is that there are tons of opportunities out there to add value to the male calves in your herd through using beef on dairy crossbreeding. And I guess this isn't just male calves either, right? These beef dairy crossbred females are also going into feedlots and onto the rail and performing really nicely. And at the end of the day, though, keeping in mind that we can talk all about these beef and carcass traits and feedlot performance, but the most important thing for you remains getting that cow pregnant and back into lactation. So male fertility is still and always will be the most important trait when it comes to selecting beef on dairy sires. And just know that in the beef industry, we're thinking a lot about this. So beef breed associations, semen companies, marketing folks are all thinking about ways to add some consistency, some verifiability to these animals so that they can add value, reduce their risk a little bit when it comes to buying these dairy beef cross calves, but also return some of that value to dairy producers, which I think is very important as well. And then finally, just remembering that there's no one size fits all approach to integrating this into your herd, right? Your marketing endpoints, your risk tolerance, whether you're comfortable retaining ownership on these animals, all of that is gonna matter in how you would integrate this into your particular dairy operation. But there's lots of resources out there, me included, that are happy to talk about this more with you. So feel free to shoot me an email, give me a call, and we can discuss this in more detail. But with that, I think I am good to take some questions if we've still got a little bit of time, Liz.
Thanks, Troy. That was an awesome presentation, and I certainly learned a lot.
Troy, it's Tim Woods down in McMinn County. Is
Tim.
there any research? I take it there probably is, but is there anything out there as far as comparing this the daily gain and that sort of stuff, like comparing straight Holstein 5-weight steers versus these crossbred calves? You know, feeding for 60 days, 130 days or whatever on their gain.
Right. I'm certain that there's some research out there that didn't make it into my slide deck today, but I'd be happy to take a stab at looking at some of that and sending it your way. My guess is that you'd see something pretty similar with the Holstein Angus cross calves as you did with those Jersey cross Angus or Jersey Angus cross animals. Probably close to, a 75-ish% increase in average daily gain on those animals, finishing way quicker and performing on the rail at the end of the day. So I'm happy to look up some of that information and shoot it your way.
Well, most what we're seeing down here is the Holstein, we're mainly Holstein, so more than
Right.
Jersey herds, but we have a couple Jersey herds. But anyway, I was just wondering if you knew off the top of your head where we might go, and maybe if there's some university doing some of that.
Yeah, I'm sure that there's somebody that's taken a stab and has that data out there, but for whatever reason, the two Jersey tables ended up in here and not any Holstein stuff. So I'll be happy to send some of that y'all's way.
Thank you.
That'll be perfect.
Hey, Troy, this is Anthony Shelton. I got a quick question here.
You bet.
So recip wise, you talk about the females and the beef breeding. You had any work on the recip side of using some of these females as recips?
I guess I haven't looked at any. You mean recips in the context of within the dairy, so using lower end cows as elite cow recips?
So I'm talking about once we do this crossbreeding, whether it be Angus on Holstein or Angus on Jersey.
Okay.
You got a ability on the male calves, but using some of those females as recips and
recips. That's I haven't seen anything on that front, at least immediately, but that makes a lot of sense on the surface, right? You get a super high, high milk production female that you think would probably make a pretty good recip if you want that elite animal to gain. I haven't looked at this a ton, but have you seen anything, Liz?
Not on that specific. So, Anthony, just so I'm clear on what you're asking, you're talking about using the dairy. Go ahead. Sorry.
We have a lot of folks that will try to look for these 50-50, half Holstein, half Angus, 75 Angus, 25 Holstein to put embryos in. And so, my question is majority of them are Angus, Holstein cross types, but is there, a breed that we might be more specific, because some of these half and half 50-50 Holstein Angus, their udders can get shot pretty quick and all that stuff. So from a recip longevity, should we be looking at something besides just what we all know as the Angus, and just kind of curiosity. I mean, that's what we all have seen. We don't see a whole lot of recip cows, but there's quite a bit of embryo work being done around. So folks are always trying to lose, and is that another place for our dairy farmers to be selling these as recip cows to our registered beef producers?
Yeah, that's a good thought that it hasn't occupied my mind at all, but I'll think a little bit about that and see if there's, there might be a space to throw in some of these other maternal breeds, right? That maybe would hold up a little bit longer than that Angus Holstein cow in a recip context. But no, I think that's another unique way to add some value to this lower genetic end of the cow spectrum.
Yeah, I think also to highlight to that point is, though, if you're feeding out that female in order to sell her as a recip, you're taking on some risk, hoping that you're going to recoup what you put in on cost to get her there, and also that you're incorporating the risk of hoping that she's also a really good solid female to be a replacement.
Yes, longevity. Yes.
Yeah, and I say this with preface that my family, we buy recips for our herd back home, and sometimes we have luck with dairy influence, sometimes we don't. Just because when I was growing up, we would be like, oh, it's got dairy, it's going to be a good milker. And so we take that, that thought, and we go through it, get to the end where she's calving out, and she's not a really good maternal made mother to the calf. She's kind of harder doing, where we have to kind of pump more input costs into her to keep her in a condition to get her rebred if we used her again as a recip. So there's other inherent costs that go with that. I really like that question, though, in terms of thinking, okay, if you get a female instead of a male, what can you do with that animal? I've never really thought of it that way, but that's a really good question. Sorry, Troy, I jumped in.
No, I'm glad you mentioned that, Charlie. And I think also this idea that we always talk about in the beef industry, right, is there's a cost to milk on the input side, right? So milk isn't free when you've got a cow kicked out on pasture, right? So I guess another thing to keep in mind with those recips, but recips in a beef context, but again, I think a really unique way to look at those female calves that come from this beef dairy cross.
I'm thinking about on the starter side, Anthony, just traditional things. If we're talking about that udder and making sure she doesn't fall apart, I wouldn't select an animal for a recip that we know has a low rear udder attachment, or has a funky fore udder, or just has one of those ones that's starting to look like she needs a little bit more of a support system there. So keeping in mind those traditional things that we would select for anyway, on maybe more the dairy side than we would on the beef side, but the lower and more swingy that udder is, the harder time that calf's going to have nursing on her. All right. Well, on that note, which was very positive, thank you again, Troy, for putting this together and presenting for us today at Webinar Wednesday. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thanks, Liz. And thanks everybody for hopping on.
Good stuff, Troy.
All right.
Good job, buddy.
See y'all.
Yeah.